When most people think about the weapons that shaped the Second World War, their minds rush to the famous ones. The M1 Garand in the hands of American infantry, the German MP-40 clutched by Panzer Grenadiers, or the iconic Thompson submachine gun wielded by Allied Commandos. But hidden beneath these legendary names is a weapon that history has almost erased. A weapon so devastating, so brutally effective, that even the most hardened, highly trained commandos felt a chill run down their spine when they faced it. This was not the kind of weapon that generals bragged about in official reports, nor the one displayed proudly in propaganda posters. It was instead a creation born out of desperation, brutal necessity, and the cold reality of close-quarters combat. Soldiers didn't admire it, they feared it, because once unleashed, this forgotten weapon could shred through squads, choke entire bunkers with terror, and destroy the morale of elite units trained to fear nothing. To understand why it became so feared, you need to step back into the bloodiest corners of the Second World War. Imagine cramped city ruins, muddy trenches, and fortresses where combat meant staring into the whites of your enemy's eyes. These were not battles fought at a comfortable distance with artillery or snipers. These were savage, intimate duels where seconds determined life or death. And in this nightmare, one weapon became infamous. Its thunderous roar echoed down ruined streets. Its fire rate was unmatched, pouring out a storm of bullets so overwhelming that even commandos, men who prided themselves on nerves of steel, hesitated to move forward. Veterans would later whisper about it with a kind of haunted respect. They recalled how this weapon didn't just kill, it dominated. It changed how they fought, how they moved, and how they thought. Facing it was not just a tactical problem, it was a psychological one. Elite commandos, paratroopers, special raiding forces, the best of the best, were taught to rely on speed, stealth, and precision. They were drilled to attack without fear, to outmaneuver and overwhelm their enemies. But when this weapon came into play, their training clashed with sheer primal terror. You could outthink an enemy, you could flank them, but you couldn't outrun the storm of fire unleashed by this machine. This was the dark genius of the weapon. It didn't need to be beautiful, precise, or even reliable over the long haul. It only needed to do one thing: create an overwhelming wall of death in the first seconds of contact. And in that role, it was unmatched. For the men on the receiving end, there was no time to react. One moment, you were moving through shattered buildings or creeping through a forest edge. The next, the roar erupted, and the air was filled with a curtain of lead. Brick walls splintered, trees were shredded, and men were cut down before they even had the chance to aim. Stories spread quickly across the front lines. Tales of commando raids collapsing in chaos. Not because of mines, not because of traps, but because one enemy soldier with this forgotten weapon held the line. And while much of military history is filled with exaggeration, these stories had truth. Entire missions had been stopped cold by a single gunner, his weapon spewing destruction at such volume that even the bravest soldiers couldn't push through. What makes this story even more remarkable is how the weapon itself was viewed by its own side. It was cheap, it was crude, and in many ways it was disposable. Commanders didn't treasure it as a symbol of technological brilliance. But the men on the ground knew better. They saw firsthand how it bent the rhythm of battle, how it could turn hunters into prey, and how it forced even elite commandos to hesitate. This is why the weapon remained shrouded in myth. Because while tanks and aircraft shaped the grand strategy of the war, this forgotten weapon shaped the brutal seconds of close combat. It left scars not just on bodies, but on minds. And that is why, even decades later, veterans could never forget the sound of it. The terrifying roar that reminded them of just how fragile courage could be, when faced with overwhelming firepower. In the next part, we'll dive into what this weapon actually was, why it was created, and how it earned such a notorious reputation among the deadliest warriors of World War II. To understand the terror this weapon inspired, you must first understand the world in which it was born. The Second World War was not only a clash of nations, it was a brutal contest of industries. Every side scrambled to arm its soldiers as quickly and cheaply as possible. Steel was scarce, factories were bombed, and time was always running out. Out of this crucible came an idea that was as shocking as it was effective. Build a weapon not for prestige, not for elegance, but purely for destruction. Strip away the polish of traditional firearms and design something that could be mass-produced by the thousands, even by factories with little experience in weapons manufacturing. The result was a weapon that looked crude, almost laughably simple. It didn't have the sleek lines of the Thompson or the technical finesse of the German MP40. In fact, many elite soldiers who first saw it mocked its rough construction. But that mockery didn't last long, because when the shooting started, all doubts vanished. This weapon was the submachine gun for the common soldier. Built from stamped metal, wood, and little else, it could be churned out in weeks instead of months. Armies didn't need master gunsmiths to create it. Any factory could produce its parts, and unskilled workers could put them together. It was war stripped to its essence, efficiency and firepower above all. But here is where things turned dark. The weapon wasn't just cheap, it was devastating. Its magazine held far more rounds than most submachine guns of the era. Where others might fire in short, controlled bursts, this gun could unleash a flood of bullets that drowned entire squads. Its cyclic rate was so high that within seconds, dozens of rounds could rip through walls, sandbags, and the unfortunate men behind them. Commandos who had trained to face machine guns, rifles, even flamethrowers, suddenly found themselves unprepared for this storm of fire. They were used to weapons that gave them at least a fraction of a second to move, to take cover, to fight back. This weapon allowed no such luxury. When it opened up, the battlefield shifted instantly into a nightmare. One veteran described it best. It wasn't just a gun, it was a hammer, smashing everything in front of it. You didn't fight against it, you survived it, if you were lucky. Even worse for Allied and Axis commandos alike, this weapon could be placed in the hands of ordinary soldiers, even poorly trained ones. A farmer pulled into the ranks, a teenager barely out of school, or a factory worker given a uniform. Anyone could pick it up and, with little training, unleash destruction equal to or greater than that of elite forces armed with prestigious weapons. That democratization of firepower was terrifying. Imagine being a highly trained commando, prepared for surgical strikes, stealth raids, or lightning assaults, only to be cut down by a soldier with no more experience than the man who delivered milk in your village. That humiliation, combined with the terror of facing such overwhelming firepower, broke morale. And still, there was another layer to this nightmare. The weapon thrived in the exact environments where commandos were supposed to dominate. Close quarters, ruined cities, night raids, forest ambushes. These were the arenas where stealth, precision, and bravery were supposed to matter most. Yet in those same dark corridors and shattered streets, this crude submachine gun became king. Picture the streets of Stalingrad, the dense jungles of Burma, or the bunkers of Europe. Places where every shadow could hide an enemy, every room could be a trap. Now add the sound of this weapon's thunderous burst, echoing through the walls, shaking the ground, cutting through wood and brick like paper. For commandos trained to fight without hesitation, this weapon forced hesitation. It forced fear. And in war, That single second of hesitation was often fatal. Perhaps the most haunting part of its story is that this weapon was never meant to be a symbol. It wasn't supposed to become iconic. To its designers, it was expendable, a tool to be used, discarded, replaced, but for the men who faced it, it was unforgettable. And that, ironically, is why it has become the forgotten weapon. Because the war's victors wrote their stories about tanks, aircraft, and rifles that embodied national pride. No one wanted to celebrate a crude, ugly gun that reminded them of industrial desperation. Yet ask the soldiers who actually faced it, and they will tell you that this was the weapon that truly haunted them. In the next part, we will step onto the battlefield itself, where first-hand accounts reveal just how devastating this weapon was against even the most elite commandos. Prepare yourself, because what those soldiers saw and what they felt will make it clear why this weapon still casts a shadow decades after the war. By the time this weapon reached the front lines in large numbers, the war had already descended into chaos. Cities were rubble, villages were ash, and soldiers had long abandoned any illusions about glory. Yet even in this grim reality, the first encounters with the forgotten weapon sent shockwaves through the ranks of those who faced it. One of the earliest and most notorious battlegrounds where it revealed its true nature was Stalingrad. Commandos and assault troops moved through shattered buildings, their boots crunching over glass and debris, expecting close-quarter duels with rifles, grenades, or pistols. What they were not prepared for was the brutal chorus of this submachine gun. In one chilling account, a German commando team pushed into a half-collapsed factory. Their orders clear: eliminate the defenders quickly and move on. They crept through the shadows, grenades in hand, rifles slung tight. But as they entered the open hall, a single burst tore through the silence. Dozens of rounds filled the air in seconds. Brick dust exploded, metal beams sparked, and 2 men collapsed instantly. The survivors described the sound as if a saw was cutting the air itself. The team retreated in panic, their training forgotten. These were elite troops, men chosen for their courage and precision, yet against one gunner with this weapon, they were powerless. Similar stories echoed across every front. In the dense forests of Eastern Europe, paratroopers learned to dread the sudden roar that could erupt at any moment. In the black of night, when raiding parties crept silently toward enemy lines, one misstep would trigger a storm of bullets that shredded trees, branches, and bodies alike. Veterans recalled the weapon's unique rhythm, a relentless, hammering beat that made hearts race and spines shiver. And unlike heavy machine guns, which often required a crew in a fixed position, this weapon was mobile. Soldiers could fire it from doorways, alleys, even while running. Elite commandos who had prepared to flank static defenses now faced enemies who could move just as fast, laying down terrifying volumes of fire while retreating or advancing. One British commando who survived an encounter in Italy remembered it vividly. "We thought we had the drop on them. We came in fast, through the side street, but the moment the gun opened up, the world just disappeared in dust and noise. I've never felt so small, so helpless. We were trained to be fearless, but in that moment, all I felt was the need to survive." These encounters began to change the very psychology of battle. Normally, elite troops thrived on initiative, striking quickly, overwhelming their foes, and never allowing fear to take root. But against this weapon, hesitation crept in. Before entering a building, before charging a trench, soldiers asked themselves, "What if it's waiting for us inside?" That hesitation was deadly. Seconds lost could mean lives lost, and commanders noticed the difference. Raids slowed down, ambushes faltered, and carefully trained assault tactics unraveled under the weight of this single gun's firepower. The psychological effect was magnified by the weapon's magazine capacity. Where most submachine guns fired short bursts before a reload, this weapon kept going and going. A single gunner could unleash a storm of bullets so sustained that commandos found themselves pinned down far longer than expected. By the time silence returned, entire missions were ruined. In one harrowing event recorded in the frozen outskirts of Leningrad, a squad of German raiders tried to overrun a supply post defended by only a handful of Soviet troops. On paper, it was an easy victory, but one defender carried the dreaded weapon. He fired relentlessly, sweeping the snow-covered ground, cutting down the attackers one after another. Survivors later admitted that it felt less like fighting a man and more like fighting a machine. The raiders eventually withdrew, leaving behind their dead and their confidence. But perhaps the most terrifying part of all was this. The weapon gave average soldiers the power to kill elite commandos. Training, discipline, experience, none of it mattered when confronted with that storm of bullets. The hunter became the hunted, and the psychological edge that commandos relied upon was stripped away. And so, word spread, commandos whispered about the weapon before raids. Infantrymen feared it more than mines or artillery. Its reputation became a weapon in itself, instilling dread long before a shot was fired. In the next and final part, we'll uncover how this weapon's legacy continued to shape warfare, how it haunted the memories of those who faced it, why it was ultimately forgotten, and what lessons it still holds about the terrifying reality of modern combat. As the war dragged on, the forgotten weapon only grew more infamous. By the final years of the conflict, its sound was unmistakable on the battlefield. Veterans could pick it out instantly, their hearts sinking as the first bursts cracked through the air. It was not just another gun. It was a symbol of what the industrial war had become: brutal, mechanical, and merciless. But when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the legacy of this weapon became strangely twisted. For those who fought, its memory never faded. Soldiers who survived encounters with it often described the experience with a haunted tone, recalling the sheer helplessness it inspired. Yet, in official histories, in museums, and in propaganda, the weapon was pushed aside. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative. Nations wanted to remember the war as a triumph of ingenuity and heroism. They wanted to showcase sleek fighters like the Spitfire, powerful tanks like the Sherman, and elegant rifles like the M1 Garand. The forgotten weapon was none of these things. It was ugly, crude, stamped out of metal with no artistry, no prestige. To celebrate it would be to admit that brute efficiency, not noble technology, had helped shape the outcome of battles, and so it slipped from the spotlight. But for the men who had faced it, forgetting was impossible. The nightmares of being trapped under its storm of fire, of watching comrades fall in seconds, of realizing that training and courage meant nothing against its sheer volume of bullets, those memories lingered for a lifetime. Elite commandos, men who had once prided themselves on their fearlessness, spoke of how this weapon humbled them. In memoirs, some admitted that their confidence cracked after just one encounter. One British paratrooper wrote decades later, "I faced artillery, tanks, even air raids, but nothing haunted me more than the sound of that gun. It stripped you bare. It made you feel like all your training, all your bravery counted for nothing." The irony is that the very qualities that made the weapon terrifying, its simplicity, its mass production, its crude design, also ensured its place as a forgotten chapter of history. It wasn't glamorous enough for movies, not prestigious enough for generals to boast about. But among soldiers, its legend endured. Even after the war, militaries studied its design. They saw how firepower could be multiplied cheaply, how psychological terror could be built into a weapon not by design, but by sheer output. In the decades that followed, echoes of its philosophy appeared again and again in new weapons. Simple, mass-producible arms meant to overwhelm, not impress. The forgotten weapon had quietly set the stage for a new kind of warfare. And yet, its most enduring legacy is not technical, it is human. The weapon revealed a truth that no commando training manual could prepare for: that courage has limits. Even the most elite soldiers, men forged in discipline and hardened in battle, could be broken when faced with overwhelming, relentless fire. That is why veterans described it not as just a weapon, but as a force of nature, something beyond control, beyond reason. To them, it was like a storm, sudden and unstoppable, reducing even the bravest fighters to survivors scrambling for cover. This is the real tragedy of the forgotten weapon. It never received parades, never stood as a proud monument of engineering. But in the shadows of war, in the ruined streets of Stalingrad, the frozen forests of Russia, the bunkers of Europe, and the jungles of Asia, it left its mark. A mark carved not in history books, but in the memories of those who lived through it. And so, when we talk about the weapons that defined World War II, it is easy to remember the famous ones, the iconic ones, the celebrated ones. But the soldiers knew better. They remembered the crude, brutal, uncelebrated gun that could halt even the most elite commandos in their tracks. That is why it is called the forgotten weapon. Forgotten by history, perhaps, but never by those who saw it in action. For them, its roar will haunt forever.